Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you had a great long weekend. Today I'm going to finish up 25.2 with Cladograms. This is looking at the evolutionary tree of animals. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but it'll be available to you throughout the week through any assignments that we do. So just keep that in mind. First thing that we want to talk about is how animal phyla are defined. Generally speaking, when scientists are making these definitions, we define animal phyla according to two things. Number one is the adult body plan. So if you think for us, our body plan was we have 4 limbs, we've got bilateral symmetry, we basically have 2 arms, a torso, we have cephalization, so we have a head, and then we have a body. So here's the bilateral. So my blob person has this body plan as an adult. The other one is something that we've talked about before, and this is how the embryo develops. If you noticed, when we talked about different embryonic developments, we were talking about animals, they all developed in much the same way. So scientists look at these two things in order to help us. Now, evidence, we gather it from 3 main sources. First one, of course, is living animals. Other one is fossils. And lastly, we have DNA. Now, ideally, we want all 3 of these because they give us the biggest picture. There are pros and cons to each. So, for example, try to think of some of your own, but for example, living animals, it's easy, it's visual, we can see what's in front of us, and there's lots of detail. When we have the opportunity to look at animals that are currently alive, we have lots of ways of telling what their body plans are, how they develop. The downside to this, the big one that I can think of, and if you can think of more, feel free to comment. This is, I'll call it one slice in time. Meaning, we only get to look at the animals that are alive today or very recently in terms of evolutionary history. Life has been around for billions of years, so this gives us a very small picture. By contrast, if we have fossil records, this is our links we can look at many times. For example, looking at dinosaurs, we're actually looking at several 100 million years worth of time between the Jurassic, the Triassic, and the Cretaceous. So generally speaking, we have a lot more time. However, I'll call it lost detail. We lose a lot of detail when it comes to fossils because the main thing that survives is the bones. So if this is, say, a T-Rex skeleton, we have recently thought that T-Rexes and other dinosaurs, since they have a close relationship with birds, may have actually been feathered. But feathers would not have survived the fossilization process, which leads to, maybe this picture of a T-Rex a lot of us are familiar with. Recently, people have been suggesting that maybe, a T-Rex looks like this. And then there's other people that go to the full extent and say, what if they were just giant birds? Which leads to possibly my favorite version of a T-Rex, which looks like a big sparrow. Lastly, we have DNA. This is good to compare genes, meaning that we can link ancestors and species. The problem with this is it is complex. And I'll put an asterisk near it. Time is also part of this. It really depends, but DNA is not a super long-lived molecule. It doesn't necessarily survive fossilization. It's very difficult to find good DNA. So this also has, to an extent, a limitation. All right, so what can we do with this? If we think back to our cladograms, this one you'll find on page 742. I think it's also in our work module. You can see all the different creatures, and what they have here is these sort of nodes that we've talked about before. So they have like everything here is multicellular. So over here we would have a single-celled ancestor, and then multicellular organisms develop. You can see we have our different phyla. So we have sponges here, we have cnidarians here, arthropods, flatworms. There's a different type, or echinoderms, and then we have chordates over here. Couple of things to keep in mind. There is a sort of a theme with our cladograms, and that's to think that as we go this way, things get more complex. A jellyfish is less complex than a cow. Also, though, one of the things I want to bring to your attention, if I highlight segmentation, I can actually find it in 3 different spots. I can find it here, I can find it here, and I can find it basically for anything over here, which means they've evolved segmentation differently 3 times, or what scientists would say is segmentation has evolved analogously, 3 times, which means that they've evolved separately. Through their own processes of evolution, different organisms have developed segmentation on their own, which means that segmentation is probably a good body plan. If it comes up several times of its own accord, if several different species kind of reach the same conclusion, this means that it's probably working for them. All right, next up, going quickly, I'll look at echinoderms. So there is something called a changes within phylums. You can think of this as sort of a themes and variation. So here we have a bunch of different echinoderms. These are our starfish. Other things that include are sea urchins and sea cucumbers. Now, interesting things about this, echinoderms are known for sort of this 5-way symmetry. If we think of like a regular starfish, I can divide it up sort of 5 ways radially. Believe it or not, all echinoderms have some sort of variation of this. A sea urchin, which looks kind of like a ball, actually has kind of these large 5-part trunks that wrap themselves up in a circle. They're mostly fused now, but they still have this rudimentary 5-way symmetry. And even sea cucumbers that look more like worms, their mouth actually looks like almost like an inverted star, where it has these 5 teeth that go around radially. So even they, looking as different as they do, have this sort of same theme with a variation. Another way we can think of it is if we look at land vertebrates for a second, they are all going to be chordates. They generally have two segments with 4 appendages or limbs. If we think of any sort of land animal that has a backbone, we're going to find there's 2 main body sections and 4 limbs. Now, In a couple cases, we refer to this as a tetrapod, by the way, there are animals that have lost them. So an example is snakes had this feature, then lost it. So even the exceptions, if we look back in fossil records, we can find that they have this theme and then they varied it to match their own thing. Another example of this is whales. So this would be an example of a variation. And you can probably think of a few other variations on this theme. Not all limbs serve the same purpose in these animals. Some of them de-evolve them depending on what they need. Just keep that in mind. The last thing I want to talk about, just to keep the time down on this, we're approaching 12 minutes, is finally body plans and evolution, sorry. So what you can think about this is body plans are evolutionary experiments. Basically, it is a way that evolution can test out different things. And this is still the same as what we talked about before. This is based on random variation. Now, other key factors are fit to environment and genetic drift. Basically, everything we covered in our evolution is going to be part of this experiment. How well they fit in with their environment, how they evolve randomly. Now, a really easy way to think about this is if the body plan works, the phylum still exists, or the species still exists, if you want to get more specific. Now, what I mean by works, we need two things. It needs to survive, and it needs to be able to reproduce. So long as a body plan allows an organism to survive and reproduce, and it continues to do so, the phylum will still exist. So if I go back, all of the animals here are able to achieve survival and reproduction on some level, no matter how complex they are. On the flip side, if the body plan stops allowing either of those two, I'm sure you can guess what's going to happen. Either the species or potentially the phylum will go extinct. Now, generally speaking, this isn't going to happen on its own. This is likely going to be something changes within the environment. There are several cases in history where they're known as mass die-off or mass extinction events, where huge chunks of phylum or species were no longer able to survive. There are a few cases of entire phylums going extinct. However, it is very, very hard to find evidence of this because it would be all in fossil records. We can't rely on living species anymore. However, this is all I wanted to cover for today. This should give you enough to go over the rest of the module. Check a look on Teams and our assignments for additional information. Thanks. Bye.